I was standing in the middle of a perfectly manicured golf green holding my grandfather's original ranch deed, while a woman in a pastel visor screamed that I was trespassing on my own land, and if I did not leave immediately she would call the police and have me arrested, and the absurdity of that moment hit me so hard I almost laughed, because 10 minutes earlier I had been following fresh tractor ruts that cut straight through what used to be my cattle path and now ended at a decorative sand bunker with a tiny flag fluttering where my fence line used to be, and as she waved her phone in my face threatening me with jail time, I realized someone had not only built a golf course on my inherited ranch, but had done it so confidently that they genuinely believed I was the criminal. The ranch had been in my family longer than the town itself existed, and when my grandfather passed away the land came to me with all its dusty paperwork, quiet responsibilities, and deeply personal history, and I did not rush into changing anything because I respected what it was and what it meant, and for the first few months after the inheritance I barely visited, except to walk the boundaries and sit on the porch where he used to drink his coffee and watch the sun climb over the hills. But everything changed the morning I drove out there and found a new wrought iron sign bolted into my soil announcing Fairway Estates private course residence only, with my cattle gate chained shut behind it like my land had been quietly kidnapped while I was busy living my life. At first I thought it had to be some kind of mistake, because people do not just build golf courses by accident, and I assumed maybe a neighboring development had crossed a line or two, but as I walked deeper into the property my stomach dropped, because the changes were not small or temporary, they were massive, deliberate, and expensive. Fences had been ripped out, irrigation lines were rerouted, the old dirt road my grandfather used for equipment had been paved and curved to match cart paths, and the creek we relied on for livestock water now fed an artificial pond with a fountain spraying proudly in the middle like it was mocking me, and I stood there listening to the buzz of distant lawn equipment, realizing someone had made long-term plans for land they did not own. I had barely processed the shock when a golf cart rolled up carrying two men in matching polos, and a woman whose expression already told me she had decided everything about me before I opened my mouth, and she immediately demanded to know how I got past the gate, and when I explained calmly that this was my property she laughed a sharp dismissive laugh, and told me I must be confused because the homeowners association had jurisdiction over all common areas including the course, and when I said that word inherited, her smile tightened and she told me inheritance disputes were not her problem and that I was interfering with a private amenity and needed to leave or face consequences, and that was the first time the word trespassing came out of her mouth, and I felt something shift inside me because confusion turned into anger and anger turned into clarity. I asked who approved the construction, who signed off on land use permits, who decided to remove fences and reroute water, and she waved her hand like details bored her, and said the HOA board had handled everything years ago, and that if my family had owned anything here it would have been addressed during development, and I remember thinking how fascinating it was that they had rewritten my family's history without ever meeting us, and how confident entitlement sounds when it echoes inside a gated community meeting room instead of on the land itself. I left that day not because I was intimidated but because I knew better than to argue facts with people who did not believe facts applied to them, and on the drive home I pulled out the deed again and read it line by line like my grandfather had taught me, noting the original survey references, the creek easements, the cattle paths, and the boundaries that were described using landmarks older than the golf course itself, and I realized something important. This was not a misunderstanding, this was a calculated gamble where someone assumed an inherited rural property would stay quiet, unmonitored, and legally unchallenged, and they were wrong. Over the next few days I started making calls: county records, survey office, zoning commission, water authority, and every conversation confirmed the same thing: no transfer, no sale, no easement, no permission, and definitely no approval for commercial recreational development on agricultural land, and the more I learned the clearer it became that the HOA had not just crossed a line, they had buried it under sod and hoped no one would notice. Still, I was not prepared for how aggressive they would become once they realized I was not going away, because the next time I visited the ranch a printed notice was taped to the gate accusing me of harassment of residents, unauthorized access, and potential legal action, and it included an HOA letterhead and a fine amount that made me laugh out loud because it was addressed to the property owner, which was me, and signed by people threatening me for using my own land, and that was when I understood. This was going to be a fight not just over acreage but over arrogance, power, and the dangerous confidence of people who think money and committees can overwrite reality, and as I stood there listening to golf carts hum across what used to be pasture, I promised myself one thing: I would let them keep digging, because the deeper they went the harder the truth was going to hit them. Shocked and started feeling methodical because anger burns hot and fast, but strategy takes patience, and I knew if I rushed back onto the land waving paperwork I would give them exactly what they wanted, which was a reaction they could label as disruptive. So instead I spent the next week quietly documenting everything like my grandfather used to when cattle went missing or fences were cut: photographs, timestamps, GPS coordinate, copies of letters, and screenshots of every threatening notice they sent, and it amazed me how quickly the HOA escalated once they realized I was not intimidated, because within days my phone started lighting up with voicemails from people who never introduced themselves but spoke with the confidence of authority, telling me I was interfering with community assets and that legal action would be swift if I continued harassing residents by appearing on site, and each time they said site instead of ranch it felt like another small theft of reality. I finally decided to attend one of their HOA meetings, not to argue but to listen, because people say revealing things when they think they are among their own, and the meeting was held in a polished clubhouse that sat squarely on what used to be my western pasture, and walking into that building felt like stepping into a parallel universe where my family's land had been rebranded as a lifestyle, and when I signed in and wrote my name under homeowner guest, the room went quiet for a second before the same woman from the golf cart recognized me, and whispered sharply to the man beside her, and suddenly every eye was on me like I had tracked mud onto a white carpet. The meeting itself was a masterclass in entitlement, as board members casually discussed landscaping budgets, tournament schedules, and liability insurance, without once acknowledging that the land beneath them was disputed, and when I finally spoke, and calmly asked which document granted them use of my property, the room erupted into overlapping voices accusing me of derailing the meeting, spreading misinformation, and threatening property values, and someone actually suggested I was trying to extort the community, which would have been funny if it was not being said so seriously, and that was when a lawyer sitting near the front stood up and introduced himself as counsel for the HOA, and told me in a smooth, rehearsed tone that any ownership claims should be addressed through proper legal channels, and not disruptive behavior, and I asked him directly if he had reviewed the deed and survey, and he hesitated just long enough to answer the question without answering it, and that hesitation told me everything. After that meeting the tone shifted from condescending to aggressive, because they stopped pretending I was confused and started treating me like a threat, and within 48 hours I received a certified letter accusing me of trespass, vandalism, and potential interference with emergency access, which was particularly rich considering they had rerouted the only service road that ambulances used to reach the far side of the valley, and as I read through the accusations I realized they were projecting every illegal thing they had done onto me, hoping volume would replace truth, and I could feel the pressure mounting, because friends started calling asking why my name was being mentioned on community forums, and why there were posts claiming I was trying to shut down the golf course out of spite, and that was when it stopped being just about land and started being about reputation, because these people were comfortable lying publicly as long as it protected their illusion of control. I went back to the ranch one evening just before sunset and walked the boundary, slowly retracing the old fence lines and imagining my grandfather riding alongside me, pointing out where the creek flooded in spring and where cattle preferred to cross, and I felt a strange calm settle in, because this land remembered us even if the HOA did not, and standing there I noticed something important: the golf course irrigation had been tied directly into the creek without proper permits, and the water Authority took that kind of thing very seriously, so the next morning I made a quiet call and requested an inspection, not mentioning the HOA by name, just stating that an unapproved diversion might be occurring on agricultural land, and I hung up feeling like I had finally moved a piece on the board. The inspection was scheduled for the following week, and I did not tell anyone because surprises matter, and sure enough the day inspectors arrived the HOA panicked, sending out emails claiming a routine audit and instructing residents to avoid the back nine, and watching from a distance I saw the same woman pacing near the pond gesturing wildly at the inspectors as if confidence alone could rewrite regulations, and by the end of the day, bright orange notices were posted near the water features, citing potential violations, and suddenly the golf course did not look quite so pristine. That night another certified letter arrived, this one threatening an emergency injunction against me and accusing me of retaliation, and that was when I laughed, because they had no idea how much evidence I already had and how little patience regulators have for unauthorized development, and as I placed the letter in my growing folder I realized this was no longer a question of if the truth would surface but how dramatically it would do so, and as the sun set over a fairway that used to be pasture I knew Chapter 2 was ending with the HOA still shouting but no longer standing on solid ground. From loud confidence to frantic control, and that change was subtle but unmistakable because people who are winning do not send daily emails reminding everyone they are right, and suddenly my inbox was full of updates warning residents not to engage with me, not to speak to inspectors, and not to share documents without board approval, which only confirmed that fear had crept into their carefully landscaped paradise, and I used that window quietly because pressure reveals cracks and cracks reveal truth. The first crack came when a county surveyor returned my call and confirmed that the original boundary markers referenced in my grandfather's deed had never been legally moved, and that any modern plat maps that ignored them were overlays, not authority, and hearing that felt like someone finally saying out loud what the land itself already knew, and armed with that information I requested a formal boundary verification which required public notice, and that single procedural step caused absolute chaos because suddenly the dispute could not be handled behind clubhouse doors and golf carts, it had to exist in daylight where records mattered. The HOA responded by doubling down, and within days I was served with papers alleging that I had created a hostile environment, disrupted recreational use, and endangered residents by interfering with community infrastructure, and reading those accusations was surreal because the infrastructure they referenced was built without permission on land they did not own, and yet they framed themselves as victims so convincingly that, for a brief moment, I wondered how many people believed them simply because the letterhead looked official. I decided to attend the site during the survey verification, not to interfere but to observe, and that morning was tense because residents lined the paths whispering as if watching a courtroom drama unfold on grass, and the same HOA president stood near the surveyor with folded arms trying to appear calm while subtly guiding him away from certain areas, and that attempt backfired spectacularly when the surveyor insisted on following the original deed markers instead of the golf course layout, and as he placed flags along the old fence line it became painfully obvious that entire sections of fairway tee boxes, and even part of the clubhouse patio, were sitting squarely on my ranch. The silence that followed was heavy, and no one said anything because the visual evidence spoke louder than any argument, and I watched faces shift from smug certainty to quiet dread as people realized they had been paying dues for amenities that were never legally theirs. That should have been the end of it, but entitlement rarely bows out gracefully, and instead of acknowledging the findings, the HOA president accused the surveyor of bias and demanded a halt to proceedings, which prompted the surveyor to calmly remind her that county verification was not optional and that obstruction could carry penalties, and that was the first time I saw real fear in her eyes because authority she did not control had entered the picture. Things escalated further when the HOA attempted to block my access road again, citing safety concerns, and this time, they called the sheriff themselves expecting enforcement on their side, but the deputy who arrived reviewed the deed survey flags and notices, and after a quiet conversation, informed the board that they were the ones potentially trespassing, and watching that realization ripple through them was almost painful because it shattered the narrative they had built around themselves as protectors of order. Still, they tried one last tactic and organized an emergency meeting inviting residents to rally against me, framing the issue as an outsider threatening their community, and I attended again, not to speak but to listen, and what I heard was revealing because board members contradicted each other, timelines shifted, explanations changed, and when someone asked why the land purchase had never been disclosed, the room fell silent, and that silence said more than any confession. After that meeting, emails, leaked minutes disappeared from the website, and suddenly the HOA lawyer, who had spoken so confidently before, stopped returning calls, and that was when my own attorney advised me to prepare for the endgame, because organizations in this position either settle quietly or implode publicly depending on how long they cling to denial. The next development came unexpectedly when a resident reached out privately asking to see my documentation, and when I showed her the deed survey and inspection notices, she admitted the board had assured residents everything was legal and that no one needed to worry, and that admission mattered because it meant the HOA had misrepresented facts to its own members, which carried serious consequences. By the end of Chapter 3, the balance of power had shifted, even if the HOA refused to admit it because regulators were involved. Residents were asking questions, and the land itself had been publicly marked as mine, and standing there watching flags flutter where manicured grass once hid the truth, I felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness because this never needed to happen, and yet it did because some people believe confidence can replace consent and authority can be assumed rather than earned. And as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across a golf course that never should have existed, I knew the unraveling had only just begun. Pretending this was a minor misunderstanding and instead moved into full damage control mode, which would have been impressive if it had not been so transparent, because suddenly there were glossy emails about unity, community values, and protecting investments, all carefully worded to avoid mentioning ownership, and every message ended with reminders not to speak to outside parties, which only fueled suspicion among residents who were now watching survey flags slice through their fairways like warning signs. The county did not move quickly, but it moved steadily, and each step added weight to the truth, because notices were posted, hearings were scheduled, and the Water Authority followed up with a second inspection that resulted in partial shutdown of the irrigation feeding the decorative pond, which turned a once sparkling centerpiece into a muddy bowl, and that visual alone did more damage to HOA confidence than any legal letter could have. The board reacted by accusing me of intentionally sabotaging the course and claimed residents were suffering because of my actions, and when that narrative failed to stick, they pivoted again, announcing a proposal to negotiate an easement retroactively, as if permission could be purchased after the fact, and when their attorney finally called my attorney with that idea, the response was simple no, because easements are agreements, not apologies, and that rejection sent them spiraling. What followed was a frantic attempt to rewrite history as the HOA circulated a timeline claiming verbal approvals dating back years, which collapsed instantly when county officials requested documentation and none existed, and it became painfully clear that the board had either ignored legal advice or never sought it at all, and instead relied on the assumption that rural land owners would not push back. The pressure mounted when residents began demanding answers at meetings, asking why their dues were funding lawyers' fines and restoration costs, and why the board had never disclosed the risk, and watching recordings of those meetings later, I could hear the strain in the president's voice as she dodged questions, blamed contractors, blamed former board members, and blamed me, while never once accepting responsibility. Meanwhile, I continued to do very little publicly, because the more they talked the more they contradicted themselves, and when silence is paired with documented facts it becomes unsettling to people who rely on noise to maintain control. The real turning point came when the county issued a stop-use notice for portions of the course citing unauthorized development on agricultural land and potential environmental violations, and that notice meant certain holes were closed immediately, which triggered outrage among residents who suddenly felt the consequences of decisions they had trusted others to make, and my phone began ringing with unfamiliar numbers from homeowners who wanted explanations, apologies, or reassurance, and I gave them none, because this was never a personal feud with residents, it was about accountability. The HOA attempted one last intimidation tactic by filing a motion alleging that my presence on the land constituted harassment, and when that motion reached a judge it was dismissed in minutes because ownership was not ambiguous anymore, and that dismissal stripped them of their favorite threat and left them exposed. As the weeks passed, contractors stopped showing up, maintenance declined, and the once pristine course began to look tired and neglected, and there was something poetic about watching nature slowly reclaim what had been forced onto it, because grass grew, uneven irrigation lines leaked, and the pond continued to shrink, revealing rocks and debris beneath the surface like a metaphor no one wanted to acknowledge. Residents grew restless, and a recall petition circulated quietly, gaining signatures, and when the board discovered it they accused me of manipulating the community, which was ironic, because I had not spoken to anyone directly about the petition, and yet their fear betrayed them again. The recall vote was scheduled, and while I did not attend, I watched the results later with a mixture of relief and inevitability, as 2 board members were removed and replaced by residents who immediately requested full disclosure of legal exposure, and that request opened the floodgates because once internal emails were reviewed it became clear that warnings had been ignored and dissent silenced. By the end of Chapter 4 the narrative had completely flipped because the HOA was no longer a united authority but a fractured group scrambling to contain a mess of its own making, and regulators were no longer asking questions but issuing instructions and timelines for remediation, and standing on the edge of the property watching surveyors recheck markers and contractors discuss removal plans. I felt a quiet sense of justice, not because I had won but because the land was finally being seen for what it was again, not a commodity, not an amenity, but a living place with history and limits. And as the sun set over half-closed fairways and silent carts, I knew the most dramatic consequences were still ahead, because entitlement rarely ends quietly, and people who build castles on land they do not own always act surprised when the ground gives way beneath them. From loud public spectacle to quiet expensive reckoning, and that phase was far more unsettling for the HOA, because there was no crowd to posture for and no narrative to spin, only invoices, deadlines, and consequences that could not be voted away, and it began with the county issuing a formal remediation order outlining exactly what portions of the land had to be restored, and by when, including removal of turf, irrigation, piping, cart paths, fencing, and any structures encroaching on agricultural boundaries, and the sheer length of that document alone caused panic, because every paragraph represented money, time, and admission of wrongdoing, and suddenly the board meetings that once ran long with speeches and applause now ended early with tense silence, as residents realized their dues were being swallowed by mistakes they never approved. Contractors who had once bragged about the beauty of the course now walked the land with clipboards discussing soil compaction, erosion, and damage to natural drainage, and I stood nearby listening as they explained that restoring pasture after heavy recreational development was not a simple reversal but a process that would take months if not years, and watching that realization sink in for board members who had assumed everything could be fixed with a check was quietly satisfying, because nature does not negotiate the way committees do. The HOA attempted to negotiate again, this time proposing a long-term lease that would allow them to keep part of the course operational while paying rent and funding restoration elsewhere, but the offer was built on the same flawed assumption that access equaled entitlement, and my response through council was firm, because the land had already been altered without consent, and I was not interested in legitimizing that behavior retroactively, and that refusal triggered internal conflict as some residents accused the board of mishandling negotiations, while others demanded that the entire course be abandoned to stop the bleeding. What made the situation worse for the HOA was that insurance declined coverage once it became clear the development was unauthorized, which meant legal fees, fines, and restoration costs were coming directly out of reserves and dues, and that financial pressure changed attitudes quickly, because entitlement thrives when consequences feel distant and collapses when they show up on monthly statements. Meanwhile, the Water Authority issued additional penalties related to the creek diversion and required environmental monitoring, and that decision attracted local media attention, which the HOA desperately tried to avoid, but the story was too compelling. A golf course built on inherited ranch land threatened with trespassing claims, now facing removal orders, and the first time a reporter called me for comment, I declined politely, knowing that silence allowed facts to speak louder than soundbite. Residents, however, were less restrained and began sharing their frustrations publicly, which only amplified the narrative that the HOA leadership had acted recklessly and dishonestly, and by the time the first restoration equipment arrived to tear up turf and remove irrigation, the illusion of permanence was gone, and what remained looked fragile, temporary, and wrong. I visited the ranch frequently during this phase, not to gloat, but to reconnect with what mattered, because seeing grass peeled back revealed soil my grandfather once worked, and the smell of earth, after years under artificial landscaping, felt like a homecoming, and I imagined cattle moving through those spaces again, and equipment traveling the old paths uninterrupted, and that vision grounded me during moments when legal updates felt overwhelming. The HOA made one final attempt to assert control by proposing a special assessment to fund litigation against me, framing it as a necessary defense of community assets, and that proposal failed spectacularly because residents had reached their limit and voted it down, which effectively stripped the board of its last aggressive option and forced them into compliance mode. At that point, lawyers shifted from adversarial language to settlement discussions focused on minimizing exposure, and when my attorney presented the documentation showing ignored warnings, altered records, and misrepresentations to residents, the tone changed completely, because accountability had finally arrived, and it was undeniable. The settlement terms that emerged were not dramatic, but they were decisive: full restoration of encroached land, payment for damages, legal costs, and a public acknowledgement of ownership, which mattered more to me than money, because it corrected the narrative and restored reality, and watching board members sign those documents felt like witnessing the end of a long denial cycle. As equipment removed cart paths and reshaped land, the course lost its identity, and residents walked past construction barriers with mixed emotions, some angry, some embarrassed, some relieved, and I felt compassion for them, because many had bought into a dream sold by people who valued image over integrity. By the end of Chapter 5, the HOA was no longer fighting, it was complying, and the land was no longer contested, it was healing slowly, visibly, and honestly, and standing there at dusk watching machinery idle and birds return to spaces once dominated by carts and fountains, I felt a deep, quiet satisfaction, not because I had defeated anyone, but because truth had finally done what it always does when given time. It surfaced and reclaimed its ground, and I knew the final chapters would not be about conflict anymore, but about consequences, lessons, and the long, slow work of making things right again. Remained was a strange, uneasy quiet that often follows a storm, when everyone is left surveying damage and deciding what kind of people they will be afterward, and for the HOA that quiet was filled with meetings about budgets, restoration schedules, and legal compliance, rather than power plays and threats, and I could feel the shift every time I drove past the former clubhouse and saw lights on late with no laughter, just silhouettes hunched over paperwork, because rebuilding trust is far harder than building fairways. Restoration work accelerated as deadlines approached and heavy equipment moved carefully along paths that had once been cart lanes, reshaping contours, pulling out drainage pipes, and breaking up compacted soil, and the irony was not lost on me that machines similar to those my grandfather used to care for the land were now undoing the damage caused by a desire to turn it into something it was never meant to be, and I spent hours out there, talking quietly with the crews, explaining where cattle used to move and how water naturally flowed, and they listened, because restoration requires memory as much as technique. Residents began approaching me more openly during this phase, some apologetic, some defensive, some simply curious, and I treated them all the same, calmly, honestly, without accusation, because this conflict was never about neighbors, it was about governance and unchecked entitlement, and many admitted they had trusted the board without question, because the idea that something so large could be illegal never crossed their minds, and that admission mattered because it showed how easily authority is assumed when wrapped in professionalism and polished language. The county conducted follow-up inspections, and each one closed another loop, confirming compliance and lifting restrictions, and watching officials walk the land without tension or confrontation felt like a return to normalcy, even though normal had been permanently altered by what had happened. And one inspector remarked quietly that this case would likely become a reference example for future disputes, and hearing that reminded me how close this had come to setting a very different precedent if I had chosen silence instead of resistance. Financial consequences continued to ripple through the HOA as reserves dwindled and dues increased, and residents faced the reality that choices made by a few affected many, and while some still grumbled about losing the course, others expressed relief that the legal uncertainty was ending, and that their homes would no longer be tied to a ticking time bomb of liability. And I understood both reactions, because loss feels personal even when the thing lost was built on a lie. My own emotions during this period surprised me, because instead of triumph I felt a kind of mourning, not for the golf course but for the unnecessary conflict and the years of goodwill that could have existed if respect had guided decisions from the start. And standing on the porch of the old ranch house one evening watching the sun dip low, I imagined my grandfather shaking his head slowly, not in anger but disappointment at how quickly people forget that land ownership is responsibility, not opportunity. Legal documents finalized quietly, and when the last signature dried it felt anticlimactic, which in a way was perfect, because true resolution rarely comes with spectacle, and the public acknowledgement of ownership was posted as required, a simple notice correcting records and affirming boundaries, and seeing that posted near the entrance where the wrought iron sign once stood felt like closure, because truth does not need decoration. The HOA leadership changed again, this time without drama, as remaining board members stepped down citing personal reasons, and replacements were chosen with transparency and resident input. And while I had no interest in their internal politics, I appreciated the shift, because it suggested learning rather than defiance. Restoration continued beyond deadlines, because land does not heal on a schedule, and grass returned unevenly at first, patches of green against exposed soil, and over time those patches spread, and the creek flowed freely again without pumps or fountains altering its course, and wildlife returned cautiously, birds first, then deer at dusk, and those quiet signs meant more to me than any settlement clause, because they confirmed the land recognized itself again. I began planning for the future, not grand changes but a return to purpose, fencing rebuilt, trails reopened, and cattle scheduled to return the following season, and each plan felt grounded, intentional, and earned rather than imposed. And friends who visited remarked on how peaceful the place felt despite everything that had happened, and I told them peace is not the absence of conflict but the presence of alignment when reality and behavior finally match. Looking back during this chapter, one realized the HOA had not just lost a legal battle, it had lost an illusion, the belief that organization and money could replace consent and history, and that lesson extended beyond this ranch, because it echoed in how communities everywhere grapple with power and boundaries, and the temptation to take rather than ask. As the 6th chapter drew to a close, I stood near the creek listening to water move naturally over stones, and felt a deep-grounded certainty that the hardest part was behind me, not because the fight was over but because the land and the truth were finally on the same side again, and whatever came next would be built on that foundation rather than against it. Transformed into something quieter but heavier, a reckoning that settled into daily life rather than exploding across meetings and letters, and for me that shift was the most profound, because it forced everyone involved to live with the consequences rather than argue about them, and the ranch began to feel like itself again, not all at once but in fragments, as fences went up slowly, trails reopened, and the smell of soil replaced fertilizer, and that gradual return made it clear how deeply the gulf course had distorted the land in ways that were not obvious when everything was trimmed and polished. Residents continued to reach out, and this time the conversations were different because there was no anger left, just curiosity, regret, and a need to understand how something so wrong had progressed so far without challenge, and I explained patiently that entitlement often wears the costume of efficiency, and that when people are told something is handled they stop asking questions, and that silence is often mistaken for consent, especially when the affected party is assumed to be distant, passive, or uninvolved, and several admitted they had never considered who owned the land beneath their homes or amenities because ownership felt abstract compared to monthly dues and manicured lawns. The HOA as an entity still existed, but it had been stripped of bravado and excess and now focused on basics, maintenance, compliance, and transparency, and watching that evolution was strangely satisfying because it demonstrated that institutions can learn if forced to confront their limits, and one afternoon a newly appointed board member asked if I would attend a meeting not to argue but to answer questions, and I agreed, under the condition that it remain informational and not performative, and that meeting was one of the most honest moments of the entire ordeal because residents asked difficult questions about trust, responsibility, and how to prevent similar mistakes, and I answered honestly without blame, explaining that power without accountability drifts naturally toward overreach, and that safeguards only work when people use them. The land itself continued to teach lessons as restoration revealed areas that would take years to fully recover, and contractors admitted that some damage was permanent, which underscored the reality that not all mistakes can be undone completely, and that truth resonated deeply with me because it mirrored the social damage caused by the dispute, friendships strained, assumptions shattered, and a community forced to reckon with its own image. I spent more time alone on the ranch during this chapter, walking familiar routes and rediscovering small landmarks my grandfather had pointed out decades ago, and in those quiet moments I felt gratitude not just for the inheritance but for the chance to defend it, because stewardship is proven through action, not sentiment, and defending the land had required patience, restraint, and a willingness to endure being misunderstood, and that endurance changed me in ways I did not expect, making me more deliberate, more observant, and less interested in winning arguments than preserving truth. The media attention faded as stories do when resolution lacks spectacle, and while part of me appreciated the quiet, another part recognized how quickly public interest moves on, leaving those involved to carry lessons privately, and that realization reinforced the importance of internal accountability, because external attention is fleeting but consequences are lasting. Financial reports released by the HOA showed the true cost of the ordeal, and residents reacted with a mix of frustration and resolve, and some organized committees focused on oversight and education, ensuring future decisions would be grounded in verification rather than assumption, and seeing that response gave me hope, because learning had replaced defensiveness and the culture had shifted from entitlement to caution. As seasons changed, the ranch continued its slow recovery, and cattle returned tentatively, at first guided along paths restored to their original purpose, and watching them move naturally across land that had been contested so bitterly felt symbolic, because life resumed where conflict had paused it, and neighbors who once viewed me as an antagonist now waved as they passed, and those small gestures mattered because they signaled reconciliation, without requiring agreement on every detail. The HOA president from the beginning resigned quietly and moved away according to rumor, and while I never sought confrontation or apology, her departure marked the end of an era defined by overconfidence and disregard, and I felt no satisfaction in that outcome, only a sober understanding that leadership carries responsibility whether acknowledged or not. Toward the end of this chapter, one received a handwritten note from a resident thanking me for standing firm and explaining that the experience had changed how they viewed authority, ownership, and community, and that note stayed with me because it captured the unintended positive outcome of a painful process: awareness and growth. Standing near the old boundary markers now clearly visible and respected, I reflected on how easily lines can be erased physically and socially when convenience overrides consent, and how restoring them requires effort, courage, and persistence. And as the sun set, casting long shadows across land that finally felt honest again, I understood that Chapter 7 was not about victory or defeat, but about integration, taking lessons learned through conflict and weaving them into a future that honored limits, history, and responsibility, and knowing that the final chapter would not be about drama but reflection and closure felt right, because true endings are not loud, they are steady, grounded, and earned through the long, difficult work of choosing integrity over ease. Felt like a conflict, but like a long echo finally settling into silence, and that silence was not empty, it was full of understanding, acceptance, and a sense of closure that only comes after every illusion has been stripped away and replaced with something real and lasting. And for me that moment came one early morning as I stood on the porch watching mist rise from the creek the same way it used to when my grandfather was alive, and for the first time since inheriting the ranch there was no tension in my chest, no expectation of letters, calls, or confrontations, just land breathing as it always had. The last pieces of restoration were completed quietly without announcements or meetings, and the equipment left behind soil that looked raw but honest, and over time grasses returned unevenly, creating a patchwork that reflected healing rather than perfection, and that distinction mattered because perfection had been the illusion that justified so much harm, while healing required patience, humility, and respect. The HOA continued forward in a diminished but steadier form, focused now on what it was meant to be: a coordinator of shared responsibilities, rather than a ruler of land it did not own, and watching that transformation from a distance felt like witnessing someone finally grow into adulthood after years of reckless confidence, and while scars remained both financial and emotional, they served as reminders rather than wounds. People still occasionally asked me if I regretted not taking the lease money or allowing part of the course to remain, and my answer was always the same: because compromise only works when it begins from honesty and consent, and anything built on theft dressed up as negotiation poisons the future, and that principle guided every decision I made, even when it cost me time, peace, and patience. The ranch slowly returned to its rhythm, cattle grazing, fences holding water flowing naturally, and with each season the land seemed to settle deeper into itself, as if reassured that its identity was no longer up for debate, and in caring for it I felt closer to my grandfather than I had in years, because stewardship is the language he taught me even when he never used the word. The broader lesson of the experience followed me into other parts of life, because I became more attentive to boundaries spoken and unspoken, more skeptical of authority that resists transparency, and more willing to ask questions when something feels convenient rather than right, and those changes felt like a quiet inheritance of their own, shaped not by documents but by experience. Occasionally new residents moved into the community unaware of the history beneath their feet, and while some stories fade completely, this one lingered in small ways: a line in meeting minutes, a cautionary reference during votes, a reminder that not everything polished is legitimate, and not every challenge is hostility, and knowing that future decisions would be filtered through that memory felt like a meaningful outcome beyond personal resolution. The land itself continued to offer lessons in cycles, because drought reminded me of vulnerability, rain of resilience, and growth of reward earned slowly, and standing there watching clouds move across open sky, I understood that the conflict had never really been about golf courses or homeowners associations, but about the human tendency to assume ownership of what we desire rather than what we are entrusted with, and that realization carried weight because it applied far beyond this ranch. I received one final letter months later, not from lawyers or officials but from the county, thanking me for cooperation and noting that the case had prompted procedural reviews to prevent similar situations, and reading that I felt a quiet satisfaction because the effort had contributed to something larger than personal justice. It had improved the system itself in a small but meaningful way. As time passed, memories of confrontation softened, replaced by moments of quiet labor, laughter with friends, visits from family, and the simple pleasure of watching land function as it was meant to. And in those moments I felt gratitude, not for the struggle but for the clarity it forced, because without it I might never have understood how deeply I valued truth, patience, and responsibility. Standing at the boundary one last time, tracing the markers that had caused so much contention, I realized that lines are not meant to divide people, but to clarify relationships, and when respected they allow communities to coexist without conflict, and when ignored they invite chaos disguised as progress. The story ended not with applause or punishment but with balance restored, land reclaimed, and lessons learned, and as I turned back toward the house with evening light settling softly over fields that finally belonged to themselves again, I knew that while entitlement had sparked the conflict, integrity had carried it to its end, and that knowledge would stay with me long after the last sign was removed and the last document filed, because some inheritances are measured not in acres but in the resolve to protect what is right, even when doing so is difficult, unpopular, and slow, and that in the end was the truest legacy of the ranch, and the story it forced me to tell.